Welcome to So What, our new conversational show with me, Stuart from the Wool Patch, and of course, Master Tailor Couturier Carol Elaine. Hey, Carol.
Hi, Stuart. Hello. Nice backdrop.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I'm in the shop. We were talking, weren't we, and trying to fit times in, and it just made sense. Well, let's do it. With your time fitted with my time, and I was still at the shop, and it looks a bit more fitting, doesn't it? With those
well,
threads.
It does, and then we can. Yes, it looks really lovely. But well, yes, well supplied there. But I think this is good because we can do this at the end of our workday, and then stop working.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And didn't it go down well, our first episode, considering it was just conversation? Not that there's anything wrong with that, but sometimes people expected lots of detailed tutorials, but actually they really enjoyed the conversation.
It's fascinating, isn't it? People don't mind just tuning in and listening to people share ideas. And of course, it's generated questions, so we can tend to those as well today.
Yes, we'll have them at the end of the show, so we'll keep you watching till then. But yeah, I was really pleased, and it was lovely to see the comments of people who joined us for the Sewing Bee All Gathered Up video, seeing them come back too.
Exactly, yeah. The community is growing, and that's a good thing. And I think, sometimes you've got your books and you have, you've got your patterns, but sometimes you get a question that isn't covered anywhere in these things. And so even if you're in a sewing class, there's some things that are missing, and hopefully we can cover those missing pieces.
Yeah. It made me smile because one of the comments we got from Teddy was saying, yeah, it's great because I can have the conversation on in the background whilst I'm doing my sewing, because I don't have to look. He can listen. And I do like that format of the audio. I will often have the radio on or podcasts on in the evening rather than watching things. It's nice, isn't it?
Same here. It is, because I can't take my eyes off my work, and I'm working for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours on a project. And I like having that conversation in the background. Books are nice. The news is not so nice. But to listen to two people just developing a conversation, there's so much to gain from that, isn't there?
And especially in the hobby that we like, because getting sewing stuff or knitting stuff on TV is very difficult. So on YouTube, you can access your content that you are interested in. So it's a win-win. Now, I thought we might start into our conversation. Johan, a good fan that watches, he left a message, and I thought, let's start with this one. He says, is hand sewing still a vital skill?
Let's ask our surgeon what he thinks. It is. I think, yes, definitely it is, because I think any skill that you learn is always a good thing. It can enhance in so many different areas. In areas you may not even think of. But just to learn a skill teaches you how things are made, and it teaches you the relationship between shapes. Teaches you, if you make something, you can repair something, if you learn these different skills. And I just think it's just great to learn things like this anyway, and to have it on hand. You don't know when a needle and thread's going to save the day, but like I said, you can make your clothes, you can make interiors, you can repair things, and even just the concept of knot tying, that has all kinds of uses as well.
Yeah, and I
in your wardrobe or out. Yeah, I was going to say in your wardrobe or, outdoor activities and things like that. Yeah. And then, of course, the old surgeon stitches. I mean, absolutely vital.
Yeah.
Yes.
Certainly today, with this idea of going against fast fashion, the Primark knocking out tops for £5. Well, no, actually, let's keep the shirt or the pair of trousers and keep using them. And if we're growing, then turning things down, turning the hem down, or repairing. We're in that idea now of sustainability. So repair the clothes rather than keep going out buying more, repair them.
Absolutely. And that's about that talking about repairing. Well, what about fit? You know, so you buy something in the shop and it isn't quite right.
Yes.
And just a subtle reshaping or restyle or rebalancing, then suddenly it's your garment.
Yeah.
You know?
And I think that's why I liked when I first saw your YouTube channel. You could have gone in anywhere with tailoring, but actually your first 5 or 6 videos were the real basics. Holding a needle.
How to hold a needle.
The
Absolutely.
thimble, the good old thimble.
Yes. Yeah. And again, things that you don't read in books. But this is why the skill is so fascinating, because it teaches you the relationship with the materials you're using, the tools that you're using, how your hands control these, and you know, how you can get better at this discipline.
Thank you, Johan, for that question. And I know Johan, he's a big hand sewer. He hand sews, he hand quilts. You should take a look at his Instagram, at all the wonderful things he makes, and his channel. He has a channel where he makes things and shows us how to make things. So I'll put the link in the description.
Please do, because I want to be introduced to him. Yeah, and it's a very good question. So thank you for that.
Right, the clocks have changed. I look outside the window now, 4:30, 4:45, and it's dark.
Look at that.
Yes,
which is
winter is nearly here.
It's nearly here. It's nearly here. And this is, I think, another good point about doing these talks at this hour is because you really can't sew very, very efficiently now, because I've got very high ceilings here. It's hard to flood the area with light. I've got angle poises everywhere. But once the light the sun clears, the sky, you know, the big buildings here, it changes. The light changes in the room. It changes on the sewing table. You have, and of course it's darker early and it's darker later. So I have to condense my working day now differently, because once the light goes, it's really hard to replace that with artificial light. Do you find that?
Very much so. When I'm doing my knitting or my crochet or sewing something up, I'll have an angle poise lamp there, but sometimes it's hard to differentiate, and sometimes that lamp is too glaring too, and it's I just want natural flat light. So those intricate things, I'll just wait till, you know, the day when you can lay it on the desk and your eyes can see it properly.
That's it. That's exactly right. So the winter months come, the clocks change. You have to manage things differently.
Yeah, I know for me, knitting is easier sitting at the fire, because and if I've got certain stitches, I don't have to even look at them. But I think it is different when you're sewing in your sewing room, for sure. In the evenings, it must be hard, but there's still nothing nicer though, is there, in the evenings to maybe do some sewing and some knitting? Not much else we could do, is there?
Well, absolutely, and all these disciplines are so relaxing, aren't they? And once the hands learn to do what they need to do, then the mind can just go off, you know, just meditate on other things.
So tell me, with the winter fabrics, do you have a favorite winter fabric? If you, Carol Elaine, were going to make a lovely winter coat or jacket, would there be a specific winter fabric you would choose straight away, or are there 3 or 4 that you quite like?
I think it would depend on the garment. I have 3 here today because I was hoping we would talk about this. Okay. The first one is good old Harris Tweed, right? So here's a herringbone Harris Tweed fabric. This is a sleeve that is half sewn up, but it's a coarser fabric, and it has a looser weave. Okay. So, and it's very active. So on the bias, it's a great stretch.
Ooh,
because
blimey,
because of that looser weave. Another property of it is because it's a looser weave, it tends to fray easily. Right. So you have to be very careful, you know, with your seam allowances.
And Harris Tweed is from the Isle of Harris, and it's all wool, isn't it?
It's 100% wool.
So it's going to be beautifully warm, isn't it?
It will. It'll be beautifully warm. And some of the tweeds, like I said, they're looser weave, so the cold and the rain can get through. So when you're working with these fabrics, if you want a very warm garment out of this, then you might back the cloth with something.
Okay.
You know, you could add a damet behind it, and then a good lining, maybe a brushed cotton lining would be a good move to get the best out of this cloth. One of my favorite cloths to work with is Loden. And
sorry, I missed that. What you
Loden.
Loden?
Loden, Loden.
Oh, I've never heard of that. Right.
And it comes from Austria. It's their classic fabric of Austria.
And what's the, sorry, Carol, what's the makeup of it? Is that 100% wool as well? Or?
It's 100% wool as well. Oh. And the finish on it is quite pearly, quite iridescent. Yeah. I hope that comes through.
You can see a shimmer and a shine. Yeah.
And it's just lovely because it's brushed and it has a slight nap, which is another thing to consider when you're making a thicker garment out of thicker cloth. But Loden is just really pretty, and it's because it's a tighter weave than the Harris Tweed. It is warmer because the holes are quite closed up. It's not as active on the bias either. It's a tauter weave. And then the third fabric which I like to work with, and you can see here, I've got another camera set up here, and this is boiled wool. And I'd like to talk about that, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Talk a little bit about the properties. So I'm gonna move around here, and so I've got a pocket here.
Yeah.
And it's pinned together. I'm going to take these pins out, and I'm going to show, that maybe when you're working with thicker fabrics, a larger pin is helpful.
Oh, a larger as in a really long point.
Yeah, a nice long pin. You see, so you can see it. You can see the beginning and the end of the pin. You know where it is. Some things to consider when you're working with a heavier cloth is that you might need a bigger seam allowance, because if they fray, you've got to be really careful that you don't lose, or the seam doesn't come apart.
Yeah.
So I'm still in the old money. I use inches.
Oh no, yeah, we're all in inches. Patchwork is all in inches, so you keep it in inches.
Okay. So you might say pick a seam allowance of about 5/8 of an inch. A half is just about right, but with a thicker fabric as well, you want to be able to press it open and have the seams lie flat. So you do need a bit more room. So I would go with 5/8 or even a 3/4 inch.
Okay.
Use a good strong polyester thread. This brand here, everybody seems to know, is the Gutermann brand, and it's just very strong thread. It's really reliable. And if you wanted a really good strong seam, you could always give a second pass, so sew it twice.
Yeah.
You wanted it strong, especially with boiled wool, because it stretches easily. So when the body moves, it puts a lot of pressure on the seam.
Okay.
So a bigger seam allowance. When you're sewing, make sure that you keep a careful watch on the edges and make sure they're even, and a bigger seam allowance. And then when you're sewing, as you're sewing, you can use this larger pin to feed in, you see?
Oh, lovely. Like your tailor's awl.
Yes, like your tailor's awl. You can use a crochet hook, you can use anything, but just to feed that in, because you know what happens when you're working with a thicker fabric, is that this top layer will become stretched over the bottom layer.
Yeah.
And you'll end up with an uneven situation at the end.
Yeah.
And this is a classic thing that happens, but you can control that by keeping your edges even, keeping a nice ample seam allowance, use plenty of pins, and without running over any of them. So there's just a couple of tips. And this boiled wool fabric is really luscious. It's made like felt.
So tell me about it if you can. I presume it's just the wool has been boiled, has it?
Yes, that's correct. It's been boiled. It's
almost
been stretched.
So it's now like a felt. It's like it's been felted in essence. So the weave has been lost.
Yes. So there is a warp and a weft to it, but you can't see it. But you can pull the threads out, but it's mashed.
Yeah,
actually.
yeah,
It like felt, and it's kind of mashed together like this,
yeah.
different
Yeah, I
layers.
get you. Absolutely.
And it's quite really bubbly, would you say?
Yeah.
But it's a really lovely cloth, and it doesn't fray. So you can make a lot of garments out of that with just a raw edge.
Oh, I love it. Yeah.
And you can just put a facing on without sewing it and turning it. You can just put the facing, you can just back it together and then top stitch it. And you can work with different colors and back different colors together.
Yeah.
Stitches just sink right in. It's gorgeous fabric to work with.
Let's talk about price, because I know price ranges are, for some people, that's what they have to think about when buying fabric. Is there we had Harris Tweed, we had I've forgotten already, Loden and Boiled Wool. Do we have a top brand that's more expensive? Is Boiled Wool at the top or the bottom for price?
I'd say Boiled Wool is more in the middle. Harris Tweed, I think, is the cheaper fabric in price. Okay. And then your Loden is quite expensive. The right. Manufacture for that is a bit fiddly, especially to get the finish.
Right.
But it depends on your supplier. There's many places you can go, and you can get any of these cloths at a range of prices.
I see.
But I tend to go with English mills, and I tend to shop where the trade shops. So a lot of the Savile Row firms. That's top end. That's the higher end. But I see a lot of questions on some of these programs where people will write in, there's a Good Sewing Bee Facebook group. And a lot of people ask this question, where can I get this kind of a fabric? Doesn't cost too much. And there's a lot of suggestions that come through that group. So I would check that out.
Okay.
And then,
Cost,
go ahead.
Cost is a funny thing, isn't it? Because ultimately you want something that's within our price point, but sometimes a fabric can't be cheap because of the requirements to make it. So it is a certain, it might be a certain higher price point because of what's required. So I know we're sometimes always wanting the cheapest one, but sometimes that just can't be the way, can it?
No, because like you pointed out, all the steps of manufacture, there's more steps. It's going to be a higher price material, isn't it?
Yeah.
But there does seem to be quite a lot of disparity in the price points as well. So it's just best to shop around when you're sourcing something, but do buy good quality. I mean, there's nothing worse than putting all that time and effort into making something, and then you find out that the fabric is not really that good of quality, or it's not that comfortable to wear. So
and I suppose we would only know that because when you say buy good quality, we would only know that from a feel or from purely the cost.
Many factors, I would say. The look of it,
okay,
the feel of it. And when you buy cloth, if you're lucky enough to be in the shop where you can handle the cloth, then give it a tug, crease it in your fingers, see if it, when you do that, I mean, of course that would happen if you're looking for linen, wouldn't it? It creases naturally, and we don't mind it so much. It's part of it's the inherent personality of the cloth. We like that.
Yeah.
But if you're looking for a wool fabric and it maybe is a blend, and you do that scrunch test and the wrinkles don't come out, well, maybe give that a pass and try for something else that has more spring in it and is going to look better, is going to look sharp and fresh.
And I suppose a lot of it will be down to experience. You buy some wool and it just doesn't work very well, and then you go, oh, I probably bought not a good brand then.
That's right. It's always good idea to get the best that you can afford. and then sew it well, and then you'll have a garment, you know, for life. You'll have a garment you can pass on, and that's
Boiled
the
wool.
lovely thing about, yeah.
Boiled wool. You think they'd think of a better name, but boiled, it doesn't sound.
It's what it's what it does. It's how it's made. Yeah, it's
True.
what it says on the tin.
Well, I think, yeah, it would be lovely to have a go with that. Doing a nice coat, like a trench coat, or that
Oh yeah,
style coat,
yeah,
a
yeah,
pea
absolutely.
jacket.
And if you're going to make a garment, and you're going to set out to make a nice, warm, cozy winter garment, and you're trying this for the first time, boiled wool is an excellent place to start, because it's what we call forgiving. You know,
Okay. Yeah.
it takes a lot of ease. If you make a mistake, you can take it apart easily. The stitches aren't going to show. You know, correct your mistakes. It presses beautifully. It loves hand stitching, and
Oh,
that can be hidden. So
yeah.
if you sew your seams and you press them flat, and you want to anchor them down with a hand stitch, you can hide hand stitches in there really easily. Or you can, you know, you can top stitch it with machine thread, use a heavier top stitching quality. It loves to just take the thread and have it sink right
Oh,
in. Got great texture.
oh, I love it. And comes, I presume, in a huge variety of colours, boiled wool.
The rainbow. Any color you want.
Oh.
It's all there. So, you know, with all this talk of color,
Mm.
and the seasons, and your primary season and your secondary season, that whole color theory thing, and what sets you off with your skin tone and your features of your face, what sets off the best, what color satisfies all that, you'll find it in boiled wool.
Oh.
So it flattering,
Yeah.
on all counts.
Oh, lovely. And I presume if you went into a shop, if you're lucky enough to go into a shop, would boiled for dressmaking fabric, are they on long bolts, or do you buy it in 2 meter, 3 meter batches, or would it be
It would be on a roll, most likely.
Yeah.
Because it takes up a lot of space, you know. So I think it would. That's how I found it, mostly on rolls. But yeah, you could probably try it online as well, and get a few samples. Get a few samples and make some tests for yourself.
Yes.
To start out. But it's a good, you know, winter's here. We want to be warm. We want to be protected. I was talking to a journalist the other day, and she said, you know, I think people are going to start investing in tailoring and making their own clothes, because we want garments we can trust now. This is post-COVID, you know. We want to be warm. We want to be safe, protected. So there's nothing like, you know, a nice, thick, warm, cozy.
Oh. Now, talking about winter fabrics, can you remember this up there?
Oh, that's your Baker Boy hat. Oh yes, I remember that.
Yes, from the Sewing Bee this season. They had the challenge to make one, didn't they? And it was brilliant. And I wanted to make one. Well, I made one. I couldn't find a pattern anywhere, but speaking of Young, before, he made a pattern piece, and I sort of copied bits of his pattern and someone else's one I just found on YouTube, because there weren't many.
Yeah.
And I had to go making my own. And you did a brilliant tutorial on how to manage all those intersections.
That complicated junction.
Indeed. And we had fun watching it on the Sewing Bee. They did really well, didn't they? And with my pattern piece, because it's this piece of cake, the cheese, like the Trivial Pursuit piece, multiplied by 8. Well, I did my toile version, and it was a bit tight, so I added a couple of millimeters onto the pattern, onto each side of my piece of cake. Well, of course, a couple of millimeters, when you put all 8 together, made for a very, a very big hat.
Oh, it's a charmer, though.
So yeah, but we had fun doing it. Wow, brand spanking news, hot off the press. Look.
Oh my. Okay.
Baker Boy Adam. Can you remember Adam from the Sewing Bee?
I remember his nautical coat.
That's it. That's it. Yeah.
Well, actually, he was a charmer. I so missed him when he left the bee. And he had a nautical theme on a lot of his garments, didn't he?
Yeah.
Oh,
We
bless
loved
him. So now he's into...
he's now literally made the Baker Boy cap into a pattern. And I saw it advertised on Instagram. And I was like, oh my God, what like this small world, because we made it and we were following the sewing bee and we were following Adam.
Yes. Yes.
And then of course
how many sections in his hat?
Well, shall we open it up and have a look? So thank you, Adam, for designing this pattern. I paid for it, so he's got some money in his pocket. I think he sold loads. I'm not surprised, because there isn't a good, well, I found a pattern out there. So look, we open it up. The Baker Boy cap.
Perfect.
Compromising of 8 panelled pieces. Oh, and I've got the stiffened peak in there as well.
Bonus. That's brilliant. Oh, well thought out.
I won't have to use the lid of a cherry tomatoes.
Oh, that's a real good idea to put that piece in there. And it's perfect for the season. Excellent. Well done. Thank you, Adam.
Look at that.
Okay, there's the section, right? There's the bill.
Brilliant.
The hat, very good.
And look at that, that's very well laid out. So we've got a child size, a small, medium, large, or extra large. Well, I won't need the extra large because I've already got an extra large.
You've sorted. Yes.
Oh, well, look at that for a pattern. I mean, obviously, I won't show it all because it's a paid pattern, but how well is that laid out? And yay, there's Adam.
Well done. Oh, hello, Ed. Oh, well done. This is perfect. This is excellent for the season we're in. It's a good project to start with. Yeah. It's fun to make. It's not going to take you a huge amount of time. The covered button is a little tricky.
Small amount of fabric, 1/2 meter of the actual fabric, 1/2 meter of lining fabric. So that won't perhaps break the purse, would it? Too much.
No, excellent first project, and it'll be warm. You know, it's a great garment to have, isn't it?
Yeah. So we could try that with boiled wool. We could try it with Harris Tweed too. So I think for next week that might be my little challenge. I think I might purchase some boiled wool. I have some Harris Tweed left over because this was Harris Tweed.
Yes. Yes.
So. Look, I've got some scraps here. So I've got enough to make another one.
You've got a 1/2 meter there. Well, it's a good thing to do if you have scraps laying around in your sewing drawers. You know, this is a perfect thing to do.
So there we are. So that's exciting. So if you want your version of the Baker Boy cap, you go find him on Instagram. This was purchased through Etsy, but I think just I'll put it all in the links below, so you can go direct there and buy a new one. And how cool is that? Considering they made it on the sewing bee, and he's got his own pattern for it. It's brilliant.
It's a great idea. Really good idea. Well thought through. And is it a covered button on the top, or is it a purchase button?
Let's have a look. Let's have a look at the instructions. It's probably right at the end, isn't it?
Because you could always purchase a button. You know, you can get a nice large button. You can get a leather button or a suede button.
There you go.
There we are.
Preparing the covered button, and it explains how to do it. And sewing it all down. So that will be really interesting. And if you want even more help, go to Carol's YouTube page and you'll see the video where you so brilliantly explained the idea of sewing 2 together is fine, but it's when you sew 2 together to another 2 to make 4, and when you have to then sew the half to the half, that's really you've got to make all those pieces meet, haven't you?
You do. And I think I remember that we set each up with the guide stitch. So we did sew along the seam allowance so that we had that point.
And
then
that helped so much, putting that, spending the time to put that stitch in first.
Yes, yeah. You know, preparation is really important. And especially on something like this, which seems quite simple. It's a small garment, easy to contain, and it's easy to handle. But because it has that tricky feature about having to match 8 pieces at one precise point, preparation is key on that. So, you know, it doesn't take much extra time to just lay the thing out, and also to make sure that you're cutting and each piece is equal to the piece you cut before. So what you can do is you can take 2 at a time, line them up, and maybe just trim. If you see an excess, just trim it back so that everything is the same size.
Now that, Carol, you just very beautifully linked that into a question. Let's go on to our questions from, we've got loads of questions from Instagram and from YouTube, but what you just said there fits perfectly with, right, where's my questions?
Okay.
This is a question from Martin, Welsh Tenor on Instagram. And he literally said what you kind of just covered. He says, cutting 2 pieces, identical sized, maybe you're cutting a bag, a front and a back, and a liner for that bag. He says one always ends up different size. So
how about that?
So yeah. So like you just said with the cap and doing that, would I lay 3, 4 pieces of fabric and the pattern and then cut round all 4 at the same time, or do you really, should you do 1 at a time?
1 or 2, and what might help control the fabric is to just use a few more pins. You know, a lot of these bean bags, these lightweight weights that people are just putting on the pattern. Well, that secures it at a point, but it's not clamping the 2 pieces of fabric together. So the bottom layer is able to shift around, you know, with just a little weight on the top. And you can use more pins. The more pins you use, and keep your pin inside the seam allowance, don't put the pin too close to the edge of your pattern piece. The more pins that you use, the more identical your shapes are going to be when you cut them out. That might help. And the thicker the fabric, the harder it is to get the shapes congruent, because, you know, it has to do with the blade of the scissors. You know, one's going one way, the other's going the other way, and or the angle that you're cutting. If you're cutting perpendicular, that's a better success. But if you're cutting at an angle.
So I've got to technically cut 8 pieces out of this fabric. So here comes, I suppose, the question that everyone wants to know: scissors or rotary cutter?
I can't say. I've never used a rotary cutter. I've always used scissors. I have multiple pairs. I probably have 20 pairs of shears here. Large tailoring shears. Sometimes it's the smaller Fiskars are good because they're really sharp and really clean. The cut's very clean. The other thing, Stuart, is press your cloth. Press it first, because all the wrinkles in it, you know, it's not flat. You're probably run the risk of the shapes not being equal.
So I'm I'm Carol. I've pressed my fabric and I've got to cut 8 of these out. Are you going to, would you fold in half, and with your lovely sharp scissors, would you cut, do you think you'd risk 2 at once?
I would. I do that, yes. Of course, if you have the time and you just want to be uber careful about this, then cut them singly. You know, they're smaller shapes, 8 of them, it's not going to take that long. If you're working with scraps and an odd shaped piece of fabric, it's really hard to fold it in half, isn't it?
Yeah.
And make the
Yeah.
best use of the cloth.
Yeah. I don't
So
think
you might, I think in that case, I would cut them singly just to make sure I've got enough.
But I feel for Martin there, because that it happens to us all, doesn't it? You cut, you think you've cut two identical pieces, but as you say, it might have shifted a little bit. You might, the weights aren't heavy, so you think pin, if you want to be doubly sure, pin.
That's right. The other thing you can do, I'll just take my work out of the machine because we were talking about boiled wool early, weren't we? And the other thing you can do is you can take your pattern, I'll just do it here. You can chalk it out. You can chalk out your pattern and then cut it.
Ah, yeah.
Using chalk.
Yeah.
And then the pattern's not in the way. And you can do this singly. That's another idea.
But I don't think Martin's alone. I think it's happened to us all at some point, isn't it?
I think so. It happens to everybody. It happens to me. And it happens on chiffon. And it equally as a heavier fabric like boiled wool. So it's also how you use your scissors. Sometimes when you're cutting, you can sort of cut behind yourself. Just drag the scissors backwards as you cut. It takes a bit longer to do that, but that's, and you can try that. It's just the more you do, the more you know how to control your tools and how to control different kinds of fabric.
Thank you. Another question from Instagram from Mimi South. She says, what material would you recommend for a toile jacket?
So if you're making a prototype, you could use the standard calico, and you might want to use a medium weight for that instead of a lightweight, because you want the hang to look similar to the fabric that you're going to use. You can use a cheaper cut of wool fabric, or anything really, a cotton drill. If because sometimes cotton drill has a little bit better finish on it, and it's equally priced to calico.
Oh, I see.
Calico has this strange finish on it where when you press it, it shrinks at different rates. So that can be a little problematic. But if you're just making a prototype, you don't want to spend a huge amount of money. But then you might go and get a remnant of something. So you can start with a good quality calico and just cut out your main pieces. Make sure you put a shoulder pad in it. And it's a good idea to put the facings on, because the facings, they take up space, and you want to make sure that you've got the right size for your jacket. So I would put the facings on and I would put a shoulder pad in. If that's the kind of jacket it is. If it's just a loose fitting like a cape jacket, well, then you don't need to worry about that. But it depends on the style, doesn't it?
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mimi South. And then we have at Hannah Davies 96. She says, any tips for hand quilting? Well, that's my remit. I've only just done a little bit of hand quilting. There is, and I'm going to have to, it's always about sharing, isn't it, here? And I've got some knowledge, but there is a lady on YouTube and on Instagram who has way more knowledge about hand quilting, and her name is Susie. Susie Quilts. She hand quilts everything, and on her blog she's got a fantastic article about the different needles and the different weights of cotton to use, because obviously with hand quilting you want a thicker cotton, because you want that thicker cotton to show through, rather than using a machine cotton, which is thinner, to go through the needle. So here, tends to be, not that we're going to be able to see it, it tends to be a much thicker thread hand quilting. And on her blog, she explains all about the different weights and then all the different needles. So whether you use a betweens, whether you use a sharps, whether you use, is it Milner?
A milliner's, yes, milliner's needle, yes.
And there are, well, you know, there are so many different needles to use, aren't there?
There are. How interesting. So Stuart, is this after you've sewn together your pattern,
Yeah,
your squares or whatever shapes you're using, and then you have, so that's your top layer, and then you have some kind of a, what, like a batting underneath that?
a batting
And
or
then,
wadding, that's right.
or wadding, and then on the back, is it another, is it just a plain fabric, or is it
Depends on,
another quilted?
yeah, it depends on how much money you want to spend. A plain fabric will be cheaper, or you can buy another printed cotton and have that on the back.
So then what are you hand quilting? Are you hand quilting along the seam lines of your pattern?
Whatever, that's the beauty. So sometimes people get patchwork and quilting muddled, or they use the word as the same thing. Patchwork is, let's show you this. I've just finished this. Patchwork is the idea of cutting fabric up and re-sewing it back together. Have a look at this.
Oh, wow.
Look at that.
Beautifully done.
So I've been testing this
Lovely.
pattern from a friend. I'll put her name in the description as well and below. Tracy has, this is her first ever published pattern that will, well, it'll soon be published. And you can see, let's take these prints here. Yellow, green, orange. I had to cut all those up and then sew all together. So this is now, and then I put sashing. So sashing are these blue bits in between. And then I've got this outer border.
Oh.
And then that forms a block. So I've got one block that way, I've got one block that way, I've got one block that way, and then the other way. So there's 4 blocks in the middle there with a border. That's the top. And as you rightly said, you then put your wadding in the middle and you choose your backing, and then you have to join it together. And you join it together by quilting. And you either do that in the machine and push it around and sew it down, or you hand quilt it with a long needle, so you go in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out, and pull through. It's like some people, when they hand quilt, they just love doing a running stitch, a simple running stitch where you take a bite, come up, take a bite, come up, take a bite, come up, and then pull through, and they lay it out on their table. Or you do what some professionals do, they have what they call a long arm, this thing that they move around, the quilt's here and the needle goes up and down, and they move it around like this. And look at this, look, my friend quilted for me. So I made this quilt.
Oh, fabulous.
Look at, can you see the flowers?
Oh, yes. Wow.
And that's what the machine has quilted. And because it's a machine, it repeats it, and you just press go. I mean, you can draw it yourself, or you just press go and the machine does it for you. Now look at all those flowers.
How clever.
Can you catch them?
Beautifully done.
And then on the back,
yeah.
Can you see the flowers?
Look at that.
Yeah.
Oh, how intricate.
But
I see.
But that's the machine doing that. That's a machine, and it's lovely having a machine. But like Johan, he would get more enjoyment hand quilting. So he would have it on the table, and people mostly when they do hand quilting will probably do long lines and play around with their lines. You know, like Japanese borrow.
That's right. I've done that kind of stitching. Okay.
Absolutely.
Just
like
even stitches, like you say, a running stitch.
and
So
and follow a
quilt,
seam or shadow a seam, echo a seam, and do.
I see.
Some people like it really thin. They call it matchstick quilting, where the lines are going to be really close together. Some people, if you're hand quilting, you don't want to spend forever doing it, so you might do it a fist apart. So you'll do a hand quilt line there, and then a hand quilt line there.
Yes, I see. So quilting is the decorative way that you secure your
Absolutely.
layers together. And when they talk about stitching in the ditch when you're quilting, then you have a special press-a-foot, and then what you're doing is you're following the seam lines of the patchwork.
Yeah, because you may
right?
not, because stitch in the ditch, you want to lose it in the seam.
Yes.
You
Yes.
you want your patchwork to do the singing. You don't necessarily want the quilting to do the singing and take the eye. So it's an artistic balance on how much do you want your quilting to show, or how much do you want your patchwork to show. So, for example, I did this over the summer. This is a huge quilt, this one. Look at this one.
Oh, look at that. What a mosaic.
Yeah. So this is a block. And I repeated that lots and lots and lots of times with different colors and different positions.
Spectacular.
Now, when I have this quilted, I want my patchwork to do most of the talking. So I'm going to probably choose, I think I'm going to choose a grey colour thread. So I lose the quilting, and I'm probably just going to do straight lines. I'm probably just going to have it going down, down, and down, because I don't want the quilting to take away from all that work.
To distract, I guess not, because that is
one. Because this one was just little pictures. There's an awful lot of negative space, isn't there? All this negative space. So I thought a big design like the flower that will sing as well, and it won't distract from this, will it? So I chose a bigger design.
Yeah, really effective. I can see where you choose different techniques.
Yeah.
Now, going back to sewing and controlling heavier fabrics, obviously you're starting with lightweight cottons, but when you get all these things sandwiched together, you have then what is basically a thick fabric. Now, when you're quilting that, it's kind of like the dilemma of pinning together and trying to have this all come out even when you cut it. So when you're quilting, do you run the risk of things bunching up, or too much ease, or not enough ease? Do you go from one end to the other? Do you quilt some here, some here, some here?
You start to the middle. So say I've got, this is my quilt. I would start at the middle and go down. So in case my tsunami wave of the top fabric, it can then be pushed out, can't it? And then start in the middle and work back out. And then some people go one side and work out that way, so it can be pushed out that way, and then you would do that way and push out that way. Because if you did a bit of quilting here and then started doing a quilting upwards, you could end up with a big scrunch and a pucker in the middle there, couldn't you?
Exactly. And the same thing happens when we're canvassing a jacket in tailoring. So we might take the whole front or the fore part of the jacket, and then we might just run a line, a basting line, right along the waist. And then as we're basting like you say, in quadrants, then with your hands you smooth the fabric out over the canvas when you're working on it. So my another question that I have is, do you cut the batting bigger than your quilt when you do?
You should always have it an inch or 2 inches bigger, and then your backing again 2 or 3 inches bigger.
Yes, I can see. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, very interesting.
Fascinating how it's all interlinked, isn't it? To make it easier for us, if you were hand quilting, you would we have 505 spray, adhesive spray, so you'd spray it on your wadding, lay your top down, and it fixes it. It doesn't glue it, it's washable, but it gives it enough adhesive so if you were moving it whilst hand quilting, it's not going to fall apart. Some people baste, just like you said. Some people do a really long baste. Because they don't trust the glue. Most people will put a safety pin. Again, a fist inch apart. So you'd have safety pin, safety pin, safety pin, safety pin, safety pin, safety pin. Because with hand quilting, you're not going to do it in an evening, are you? Hand quilting, you're probably going to do it over several months.
No, and you don't want to, you've got this great size of a piece of cloth, and you don't want the ends of pins sticking out and
exactly,
and catching on each other. So I can see the safety pin. That's a great idea.
But it is a lovely, I can imagine how lovely it is. I've not done it, but I can imagine how lovely it is if it's out on a table of an evening, you've got a podcast on and you're listening to something audio based, and you're just doing that lovely action of that and pulling through, and sitting at the table doing it. You can't really do it sat on your lap. It's got to be a flat,
big old space, nice and flat. Yes, I never really. That's true. I never thought that the hand quilting can really interfere with the intricate pattern that you've just spent all that time creating. So you have to choose the color really carefully, don't you?
Absolutely. And you can spend, when I sent this off to my friend to be quilted, you can spend a lot of time and energy thinking of the color of the thread, a solid thread or a variegated thread, then the size of if the computer's doing it, do you want the flower that big or do you want the flower that big? And how is it going to compete against your patchwork? Oh, it's another art form in itself. Absolutely. And that's why sometimes you send it off to the long armour and you are paying for their services and for their skill to choose for you. So sometimes I just do that. Because anything that big, I can't quilt that on my hand, on my sewing machine at home, because I don't have enough room to move it around, and then you've got all that excess to keep moving it around. No, give it to a long armour. The long armour will have a huge machine where it's all laid out like that, and it comes back all beautiful.
I'm going to research that. I'm going to look up I'm curious what this machine looks like. And I'd love to see it in operation. So I'm headed that direction. I'm going to go look this up.
Well, look, all the room you've got there, you've got loads of space for a long arm quilt for sure. So to the question for Hannah. So yes, go to Susie Quilts and she'll tell you all about the needles to use and how sharp they are and which needles are best and the thread weights. For sure. Right, so that's Instagram questions done. We had a couple on YouTube on the comments, in the comment section. Rob, who commented quite a lot on our previous videos, he has just started to learn how to sew. He was a patchworker and has learned patchwork in the last year, but he's now started to go into dressmaking, and he has made a few garments, and he says this: when a pattern doesn't say how to finish the seams, how do I choose a technique? I've mostly used my overlocker, but I'd love to perhaps do French seams or flat felled seams. But more importantly, how do I choose the technique to finish the seams?
I would say really good question here, because it mainly depends on the type of fabric. If you're making a blouse out of chiffon, overlocking the ends of the seam and then pressing them, they might show through. So that's where a French seam just makes everything really tidy. And it also sorts out that problem of fraying. So French seams are perfect with really lightweight fabrics or silks or things that you don't want the seam finish to interfere, when you look at the garment. Because sometimes overlocking can add bulk, and that bulk of the overlocking stitch is thicker than the fabric itself.
Oh, right.
Do you know?
Yeah,
can you appreciate
absolutely.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Where if you were making a boiled wool garment, I have used the flat felled seam, and that works really beautifully because you can trim one of the seams, one of the seam edges. You can trim that quite close because there's no fraying, and then you can fold the other one, around that. That's a really nice finish. I would say it just depends on the fabric, first of all.
Okay.
Check if it frays, check the weight of it. And if what you're doing to finish the seam ends up, conflicting and showing through the fabric itself, that's not going to be a good result. So depending on that and the thickness of the fabric, that you wouldn't put a French seam in boiled wool. It would be a huge seam, so that would conflict. That would be alien to the cloth, I would say. So just depends.
Okay. And
yeah.
I suppose it's down to experience as well, is it? So if you make loads of shirts, you'll have just learned that most shirts use the flat felled seam.
That's
so
right.
You would use a flat felled seam. So that's that.
Yes.
You only learn that from experience, then, I presume.
Sure enough. And also the directions of the pattern. It might tell you to do a flat felt seam. If you're making jeans, your pattern might say, this is the treatment to use.
Yeah.
Right. Heavier cloths then would overlock very well. A denim, a cotton drill, or a heavier cottons. That's a good finish. Sometimes you can use the overlocking technique and then just use less thread. That also works. So when I was doing, like, say, silk, like use Dupion silk or heavier silk with a full lining, I would overlock everything with 2 threads only because it cuts down on the bulk.
Yeah.
But if it's a fabric that's heavier and it's going to fray like a denim, then a 4 spool is a good secure finish to use. So it does depend. How much bulk are you willing to add? When I worked for Hardy Amy's, we used to hand overcast. We took days to do this. But we used to just hand overcast, overlock everything. Or another seam finish, you'd get a generous seam allowance, like maybe a 3/4 of an inch seam allowance, and then we would turn the edges in a 1/16 of an inch and top stitch it. That was a very finicky finish. So, I've seen finishes are really interesting because when you turn the garment inside out, you really want it to look nice.
And I presume in your experience and your skills and different tailors, do you find that different tailors, I'm going to use this seam for this. I don't care what the rule books say. I love this seam finish, so I'm going to use that. Do you find different tailors are like that? They have their own preferences.
Yes, absolutely.
Who taught them?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's it. And when you have a technique and you know it so well, you just tend to apply it to everything. And if it works and you get the results you want, it doesn't matter what the rule book says. It doesn't matter that they say you can't put a French seam in something.
Yeah.
They'll do it, and they're masters at it, so it works every time. And then it's their thumbprint, and then you see a garment and you say, oh, that looks like so-and-so's.
Yeah.
It's It's got
Yeah,
their thumbprint on it.
I love that. It's in the film world, we would call that you're an auteur. You're noticed on your work. You know a Spielberg film, you
Yes.
know a Hitchcock film. They're an auteur. Well, that's like this. You're an auteur of the tailor world. You know, oh, that's that garment because of that seam finish. Yeah,
exactly.
Well, they are, Rob. You're going to have to keep making up, keep experiencing, doing different seams, find out what one works for you, or the fabric that you're using, or the garment. He asks another question as well. His second question: my shirt patterns have told me to fold the fabric to cut out the pieces. Fold on the on the fold, isn't it? Yes. How do I make sure the fabric print is lined up properly when the fabric is folded underneath and I can't see it?
Okay. Well, the easiest thing to do is to identify where the pattern repeats and then pin through. So let's say every 3 inches you have a yellow polka dot.
Yeah.
You folded your fabric. Find 2 yellow polka dots, one on top of the other. It might mean you have to shift your fabric slightly one way or the other. Same thing works with plaid fabrics or chalk stripes, patterns like that. Match the pattern on the top layer, put your, pin through and secure it. And do that every so often, like you're quilting, like you're setting up your quilting. Just set up points at different repeats, and then you can use your hands and you can smooth everything out. If you pin something, you get a slight twist, take that pin out, do it again. Get everything lying flat. So what you're doing is you're matching your patterns. You're matching them and pinning them together before you cut out.
Well, this is good, Rob, because this means Rob is venturing into garment making and using patterns, stripes, or tweed or something, isn't he?
Absolutely. Go for it.
We want to see this garment, Rob. Let us know.
No, I'm really interested in the questions and how people then sort their dilemmas out. So I hope people will send in pictures of their work.
Oh, yes, please do. Yeah.
Great.
And our last one from Theresa. Now, I can feel what she's saying here because it's an interesting one. It's about fusing fabric. So when you're putting your interfacing on, would it be okay to fuse the whole fabric piece and then cut the pattern pieces out? So like the collar and the collar stand, rather than cutting out the pattern piece, cutting out the interfacing and then putting the interfacing onto the pattern. Is it okay to fuse the whole piece?
Absolutely. It's absolutely okay. And it gives you a better result because you're fusing everything together, and then it's stable, and then you cut out your piece. A lot of times, the act of ironing on interfacing, it can eat up more cloth than you think. That very act of putting the iron to the interfacing, and it starts to almost grab the cloth underneath, and it's we just talked about cutting 2 things out and having them not match. But you run that risk, don't you? And if your interfacing is smaller than your cloth, then that's a problem, right? So I think it's a safe bet. I do it all the time. I block fuse a piece of cloth, and then I cut out the top collar, the collar stand, the cuffs, maybe even the front band. It's a good idea.
I so wish I knew that when I was doing my shirt, because I cut out the pattern piece and then I cut out my interfacing piece. And then of course you then got to, why don't they say that at the beginning of a pattern? Why?
So unfair, really unfair. Well, The downside is it wastes interfacing.
Yes, I can see that.
Because you're going to use more, and you might waste cloth as well.
Yeah.
If you look at some of the layouts for shirts, you know, everything is within a couple of millimeters, and there's this great, you know, juxtaposition of the pieces. So it's a luxury to, if you have enough cloth and you have enough interfacing, then.
Okay, that makes sense now. Well, they are, Theresa. That you've heard it from the couturier herself. Yes, if you can and you don't mind that wastage of fabric, yes. Well, that's what I'm going to be doing for sure. Well, there we are. There are questions. How wonderful is that?
I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that very much, and it's good to talk through these things, you know, and it's good to you know, as the questions are on different topics as well, you can kind of see the garment being made.
Yeah,
you know,
it's lovely seeing what they're doing, isn't it?
Fusing, putting two pieces of fabric together, how to seam it, how to finish it. You can kind of see the garment making itself up as we're discussing it. It's really interesting.
Absolutely, and some of those questions just fitted in beautifully with what we were talking about anyway. You know, our Baker Boy cap, and as we say, cutting out those pattern pieces. I've got to get 8 the same, and with the lining as well. It's lovely from their questions as well, hearing or getting an impression of what they're making, what they could be making.
That's right, and all these questions have something to do with learning to control cloth. You know, and this all goes back to, is sewing a vital skill? But look at all the things it teaches you.
Yeah. You
know, how to control, how to use your hands, how to use tools. And I think you can apply these techniques and these procedures, you can apply it to other things.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there are parallels with woodworking, you know, with leatherwork.
So many.
With making a sail, you know, for a boat. With you know, even carving, cooking. I think,
absolutely. And in a world where we are tapping a lot now or scrolling and on digital, we're not using, well, I hope we're not going to, but even the kids are they using their hands as much? You know, that whole idea of playing and making and ripping and tearing and the control.
Yes. And understanding texture and appreciating texture. And learning to, you know, it's soul destroying sitting at a computer all day. I mean, some people are very good at it and they love it, and that's great. You know, it's well suited. But, you know, to work with your hands is and build something and understand how it's built. You know, we talked in our last conversation, Stuart, we talked about this game of opposites and understanding mirrored images and things. And that's a really good training for the brain. You know, recognizing these shapes and you see two things and you think, well, how does that go to, you know, I'm fixing something. I've got all the parts are lying on the floor. Well, now what? What goes where? This is good. These exercises and building things is really good training.
Now, talking about fingers, do I hear someone tinkling on the ivories in the background?
You do. He did say, is it okay if I do some practice? And I said, we won't hear a thing.
Doesn't matter. It's that act of playing is wonderful. So he's clearly, is he practicing, or is he improvising, or is he?
He's practicing. I think it's a bit of Bach. So it's the kind of like exercises, etudes, and very mathematical. Do you hear that? It's not. It doesn't sound like you could join in and sing, does it?
It's just that idea of using the hands, as we're talking about. Well, it's lovely.
I was going to say, so it's a great environment because there's musical instruments all over the place.
I love it.
I'm building things and there's music going on. So
I absolutely love it.
Creative place.
What before we finish, what have you got coming up in your studio this week, making wise?
So I'm making an Irish dancing costume for a young lady who's just taken another trophy.
Wow.
And so now she's wanting to have something made. I'm starting 2 wool coats, both with double-edged zips. So next conversation, I'll be able to show you those.
Oh, wow, that's brilliant.
So it's a mixture of bespoke, 1 wedding, which is a complete secret, what that's going to be about.
Yeah.
That has to be under lock and key for a while, and that's in another room. That's not even out here, so nobody can
it's
see
so
that.
good.
And then the collection I'm doing with this young lady from Austria, that's now getting buttonholed, and there's 12 pieces, and I'll be talking more about that too. So a bit of ready to wear, a bit of bespoke, a bit of restyling, really a good palette of work.
Wonderful. And well, for me, I'll be working on Adam's Baker Boy cap, so that we will be seeing that next week. So there we are. That ends another episode of So What. It's been a pleasure. Lovely talking about winter wools. By all means, get in contact in the comments below. If you've got questions for next week's episode, by all means, or just join in the conversation where we talk about stuff. It would be lovely to hear your feedback on wool. If you've used Harris Tweed, what you think about it, what you think of boiled wool. If you have an experience with it, remember, we're all about sharing and learning from each other. Other than that, I think that is it. And we will just sign off by saying happy sewing, won't we, Carol?
Indeed. Lovely conversation and lovely questions. And thank everybody for being involved. Let's keep this going.
Indeed. Wonderful, isn't it? Happy sewing, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.